the Mediterranean. The External Action Service and the Commission, with the support of the member states, it must be said, produced a new policy paper a few weeks ago, which is called the EU's New Agenda to the Mediterranean, for the Mediterranean. And it's pretty comprehensive piece of work at a time when I think everybody agrees the EU does need to raise its game in the region. There's a lot of content in it. We're going to be trying to cover as much as we can this morning, although I doubt we'll be able to do it all justice. But on the economy, there's a major new investment plan which claims that up to 30 billion euros could be mobilized over the next period to help with much needed investment, especially when it comes to jobs, opportunities for youth, and also for education, the two things very closely related. There are some interesting new departures when it comes to green transformation and digital economy, two areas where the region does have a lot of potential, but has a long way to go to realize it, and big challenges are involved with that. There's not very much on trade. Many people, of course, put hope on better and freer trade with the southern neighborhood countries as a way of stepping up the relationship, but there isn't much there. And I guess it is difficult because the EU finds itself in a tough position when it comes to offering new departures, for example, opening up more to agricultural products at this time. And of course, at the same time, this is a theme running throughout the discussion, as it is everywhere. The pandemic is preoccupying everybody in Europe at the moment, and I don't think it's the time when we're going to see major new things put on the table so far as things like that are concerned. There's quite a bit on climate, where there is cooperation going on, and investment too, in renewables especially. All of this, of course, will require a lot of reform on the part of the partners in the Middle East and North Africa, and that's not going to be easy. Some places better than others. Jordan, Morocco, perhaps have moved on there, but others are a little bit more protectionist at the moment, and one really does wonder whether there is much room to improve the business climate. It'll be tough, and it's been tough in the past. Similarly on values, because there too, there's quite a bit of content on how the EU will build on its programs to encourage support for civil society, for human rights, democratization, and so forth. But that again is going to require the sort of cooperation which has been very hard to achieve outside of countries like Tunisia in the last few years. Big challenges are involved there. And a question would be, what is the real prospect to move on as far as that's concerned? In fact, one might say that the best one can do is to hope it doesn't get any worse in many countries in the couple of years to come. And of course, the elephant always in the room is security, where the EU has had difficulties in playing its full role in conflict prevention and resolution and so on. There is one, I think, possibly positive sign on Libya, where the new government of national unity seems to have attracted full support, much fuller support anyway, from all the member states. Up to now, of course, there has been a split, especially between France and Italy, on the Libyan dossier. Perhaps there is a prospect of a bit of a breakthrough there, and perhaps there's a possibility that the EU will be able, in the months to come, as we move up to elections in Libya at the end of the year, of the EU speaking with one voice. But again, that's an open question, and the record in the last few years has been difficult. And the last thing perhaps that speakers can talk about is a little bit how the EU does this in terms of leveraging reforms, whether they be economic, governance, or in the field of civil rights and so on. What sort of alliances do we have? Of course, the Biden administration has said that they will put human rights at the center of their foreign policy, and they have been a bit tougher with some of the governments in the region, not least Egypt, as we know. But do they have the interest? Do they have the bandwidth? Do they have the motivation to follow through on this? Can we work with them as Europe in the future? All sorts of questions there to answer. Now, we have three great speakers to discuss those and other aspects going forward. And we're going to start with Nancy O'Kell, Nancy, who is an advocate for human rights and is also the director of the CAN program. Nancy's got a problem with her technology at the moment. I believe she's suffering a bit from power outages, but she's going to give us a verbal introduction as the first speaker. And she'll be followed by Charlotte Spa, who is the director of the Swedish Dialogue Institute and a former ambassador to the region for Sweden, and Mark Otte, the former EU Special Envoy to the Middle East. So we've got a pretty good lineup. We've got a pretty diverse set of speakers. And I want to now turn it over to you, Nancy, to kick us off. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And I'm really happy to be discussing this with you, and particularly with Charlotte, and discussing this very timely issue that is not just particularly important from the EU perspective. I think it's overall, and as you said, like what sort of allegiances the EU could have, particularly with the US. And I'm just going to start with like the 4 dimensions of the new agenda, which are not particularly new. Maybe the approach is a little bit different, but we're talking about investment in human development, peace and security, migration, and the green transition. And before I talk about the particulars of those 4 issues, I think we need to have 2 things in mind while we are analyzing this. First, what are the policy tools and the mechanisms to enforce all those, plans and agendas and the principles behind them? That's one. And the second thing is understanding the playing field in which all this is intended to be implemented. And to start with, I'm going to start with the second and third dimensions of the agenda is migration and peace and security. And they are both quite related. And the agenda sets out the problem clearly. The direction it's taking is certainly positive, but we need to understand what's going on right now and what the role of EU in it. And the first thing about peace and security, there is an overall trend around the world of hyper-militarization. And with the EU, the increasing investment in border control is worrying. It's not just the size of the investment alone, but also the approach and how militarized is it. And so, for example, like from now until 2027, the investment for border security is around 34 billion euros, as opposed to the overall EU agenda towards the Mediterranean of like 30 billion euros. And a lot of like analysts and specialists have looked at this approach and saying that it's, first of all, it is not improving the situation. And second, it's putting a lot of people at risk. I mean, like since 2015, there were like 1 million people like moving and or transferring to the EU. It dropped down to 150,000 in 2018, but the level of death has increased. So that's one problem when we come and look at the different aspects of that. And then for peace and security, another big issue is the issue of arms transfer and the increase in the arms transfer. Again, around the world, like it has leveled in the past 5 years, but for those countries, it has increased with 25%. So basically, you're closing down the region and pouring arms into it. It's a recipe for a disaster, particularly when we know that the rulers and the governance approach of those regimes is not particularly keen on maintaining peace, and the regional relations are really in a very conflicting and dangerous stage, which puts the populations in this region in at risk in general. So this is concerning the peace and security and migration. Those two issues are key for like just the livelihood of the people. Given also that some countries, for example, like Denmark, that just rescinded its migration or like asylum status for some of the Syrians, claiming that Damascus is now safe to live in, which is, of course, I mean, like puts a lot of people in danger. So these are all things that needs to be addressed and needs to be taken into consideration when we're talking about those two things. Now, coming to the human development and the green transition, of course, the new tool that's being introduced, the twin tool, the green and digital transition, again, in principle, is very important, particularly how this human development is sort of classified and prioritized. Is the youth, streamlining youth in all policies and all programs, strengthening the health system and ensuring the vaccines reach everyone, human rights and rule of law. This is all great. And particularly the approach addressing the youth involvement and focusing on the idea of increasing people-to-people communication. And like one example is the work that Charlotte is doing and the dialogue that her program is running, which is one of the most needed and important approaches, because as opposed to that, on the other hand, governments in most of these countries are curtailing the freedom of expression. They, you see countries, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria, they are all passing laws that curtails freedom of expression, particularly online. And the common thing between all those countries is they are all associated with terrorism, which actually like extends the periods they get arrested for, pre-trial detentions and all sorts of issues that really make it very difficult for people to have free speech and free press. In Morocco, for example, we've seen the Hamaradi, who's a journalist, and he's been taken into, has been jailed, and he has been harassed before for a long time, but this time particularly on the issue of corruption. He's been on a hunger strike, and we don't know anything about him since Thursday. So this is just one example, but there are several repeated and similar stories in all different countries. Now, having that in this kind of situation, while you have increasing corruption in all those countries as like one of the top issues out there, makes it very difficult to imagine how all those programs and all those funding channeled to implement them are going to be employed and invested and used with transparency and integrity. Because again, like Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, and Syria, most of the protests going on or the issues on the top of the agenda is the issue of corruption. Algeria last week, the protest was about that mainly. In Jordan, we've seen what happened with what Prince Hamza was voicing about issues of corruption and what happened there. And there was like very few people who are able to actually speak out on the heart of the issue. The same thing in Egypt. So the issue of corruption is key to address. If we want any of those items on the agenda is able to be implemented, also understanding like the issue of transparency and budget spending and policies implemented by the government. For example, Syria is passing laws that helps them confiscate the lands and properties of the opponents. Actually, also another tactic that's in Syria, also in Egypt, is trying to sort of, as one of the reports said, strip people of their finances and funding by adding a lot of administrative costs that puts a lot of burden on that. And I think, I mean, these are all long-standing and ongoing problems, but I think there are some positive approaches that has been taken, and I think this is in the right direction. It is going back, after talking about the level view, is the issue of policies and mechanisms. So instead of having the EU just issuing statements and condemnation, there are some practical things, for example, like the Europe-Magnitsky Law, which is very important and would be key, because in order to address those issues that I spoke about, there are two main elements that should be taken into consideration throughout. First of all, accountability, because without accountability, there will be no oversight or holding people responsible for the money disbursed and the funding and the implementation and where does money go. And the second key policy tool or issue to focus on is access to information, because access to information is at the heart of all those issues concerning transparency, concerning the budget spending, even when we talk about mainstreaming and supporting youth or the vaccine distribution, we need to have transparency and access to information. It's like, which youth are we talking about? Are they like the pro-government that are ones that are favored while the rest are in jail? Even when we talk about the vaccine, just yesterday, Egypt decided to prioritize members of parliament for the vaccine. Again, while we have hundreds of, like thousands of people who are really suffering and the rate of death is increasing. Of course, that's not in the official records because again, there's no transparency and no access to information. So that's my overall view, and we can discuss later. I'm sure Charlotte and Mark will have a lot to add to that. But those are the key issues that I see that needs to be addressed and taken into consideration when we're looking at the new agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Whilst we've got you online, I know you might not be able to stay given the technological problems you've got there, but just to pose you one question, you mentioned transparency. I've seen that when it comes to the Transparency International Corruption Index of the countries of the Southern Neighbourhood, they have all, with the exception, I think, of Tunisia, fallen down the list in the last 2 or 3 years. Egypt has gone down 30 odd places. Others, as you might expect, Syria and so forth, are in the bottom 20 in the worldwide index. And clearly there has been a problem. How important do you think it is for the EU to lock horns with administrations? You mentioned also accountability when it comes to fighting corruption. And are there, do you think, some new approaches that might be taken there?
Well, yes. I mean, as you see from all the indications, the level of corruption in all those countries is increasing. And actually, what people refer to as the second wave of the Arab Spring, like with Sudan and Iraq and Algeria, and all the protests actually in Tunisia, and the protests in Lebanon, the one common theme of all of them is corruption. And that's the bottom line of the issue. How to address transparency? I think they're like the main conventional ways are there, and they just need to be enforced. They need to be pushed actually for governments to be transparent and open and publish the government spending, but also it's not the direct issue towards transparency and corruption, but overall opening up with freedom of expression, the freedom of journalists, and ability for people to express themselves online, and actually call for the repealing of all those laws that curtail the freedom of expression, because the end results, anyone who speaks out, again, like the example of Morocco and Egypt and all countries, like anyone who speaks out on corruption is thrown in jail. And meanwhile, they are also blocking websites so that people would not be able to see the independent websites that are people trying to use as a platform for the investigative work that they are doing.
Strong point. Thank you, Nancy. We're going to move on to Charlotte Spar to take us further into this debate. And I think that last point about journalism and freedom of expression is one that she'll probably have a thought or two about. Before doing so, just let me emphasize for all of our participants that please, if you have questions or comments, please put them on the chat function. And I will do my best when we finish with our presentations to feed them into the Q&A, which we will have at the end of the presentations. And so with that, we turn to Charlotte Spar, who is the director of the Swedish Dialogue Institute and is also a former Swedish ambassador to Jordan, to Egypt. She served in Brussels. She's had a long experience of EU southern neighborhood relations, and she, I'm sure, has a lot of very original thoughts to share with us today. So Charlotte, over to you, and if you can take up some of those themes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for inviting me to this. I'm not, but so there I'm back. I will at least share some views. And Nancy started off with saying, well, how much new is there? And clearly there are some new elements, and I'll come back to them later. But I have to admit that having been involved both in the Barcelona process and then sitting in Brussels during the negotiations of the first set of neighborhood policy, and then followed very closely in the region the upgraded discussions in 2011 and with the hopes of change that we were seeing. I must admit that reading the papers, I had a fair bit of déjà vu. And maybe I'll start because of that with some of the diplomatic realities that I think many of us are facing. That on one hand, we want to have the hope, and on the other hand, we risk, if we have been working too long, to become too cynical. And let me give a concrete example. Some 25 years ago, when I was serving as a young desk officer at a desk of a country in the MENA region, I started reading reports about the country that I was covering, and I read reports from some 15 years. And I noted that every time a new ambassador came in, he or she was reporting about the hopes of the change in the country, was foreseeing that the leaders would change and that the country would change. And towards the end of their post, each and every one of them basically said nothing will change. And I can add that the son of the leader in question is still in power in the country. So I think that our trick is really to, so to say, remain hopeful but be realistic, to realize that, yes, we are building and obviously have to have some new elements, but we are building on what we are doing, and I hope that we are also learning from the lessons of the past. So your question is, will the new EU agenda for the Med make a difference? And I think the first question is it important? And yes, it is absolutely important, but will it make a difference? Well, I think that depends, and it depends on a lot of different factors, some related to the region, some related to Europe, some related to other factors. And let me just go through some of my thoughts there. First of all, if we look at the southern neighborhood, we are seeing a region that is, if anything, more complex, more difficult, more challenging, in a more challenging situation than it was has been in the past, at least during the time that we've had a neighborhood policy or a Euro-Med policy. We're seeing conflicts, we're seeing weapon proliferation, we're seeing terrorism, we're seeing an economy with a limited growth, COVID that obviously further has exacerbated the situation. We see a demographic development with a very large young population and a young population who can't find jobs. And now we have a year where in many of the countries, the kids have not been able to go to school due to the COVID situation. And we don't know the effects that that will have for the future, but I guess that that will make it even more difficult to be employable. Nancy was spending quite some time on the governance issues, and I agree with her totally and completely that I think that that is a key area. And there we are seeing a shrinking space. We are seeing polarization. We see the lack of transparency and accountability that Nancy was talking about. We see the corruption. We see a low provision of services, and we see fundamentally non-inclusive structures where big parts of the population, and not least women and youth, have been clearly underrepresented. This is a potential because both the women and the youth can positively be tapped into, but the question is, will they be included and will they be given enough space? So all of this have led to grievances, to discontent, and to calls for a new social contract. We saw it in 2010, 2011 with the Arab uprisings. We saw it again in 2019 and until the start of the COVID, and the same grievances are there, the same reasons for discontent are still there. Another element in the region that I want to highlight is the low level of South-to-South cooperation, or cooperation within the countries in the region, and how that, not least in the field of economy and trade, but also in other ways, obviously, is playing a role. So that is as regards the region. Looking at Europe, we clearly have our own political and economic challenges. We see more, I would argue, of internal divisions and split, even when it comes to the core values of the Union. We also see our own economic challenges, and that also on our side has been further aggravated by the whole COVID pandemic. Then what Nancy was talking about, we have a perception, at least in the southern neighborhood, that Europe's only interest, I think that that is wrong, but Europe's interest primarily are migration and security equaling stopping terrorism. Obviously, our interests are much larger, and I come back to that later. So that was Europe. The third element is, of course, other factors, both other actors. With the US, we hopefully will see a new strengthening both of transatlantic relations, but also of a return to more of a multilateral cooperation. We also have other actors, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and where they will go and what they will do will obviously play in. And then I think all of us who have been working for a long time with the region, and probably everyone else, realize that this is a region like other regions, but maybe more than other regions, that also offer surprises. We see every now and then different things that are happening, events that also play in, be it new conflicts or be it the effects of the climate change. So then why is it important? And and how is it important? And I think my starting point there is very much not only the geography, but partly the geography. We simply cannot afford to turn our back to our southern neighborhood, and it's not only the Mediterranean countries, but I think it also clearly goes for the whole of the Middle East, North Africa region. And we are codependent, whether we like it or not. And while we have a mutual interest for stability, we also see a stability that is being challenged, partly because of the effects of climate change, the security reasons, all the other elements that I was mentioning, the economic development. But that is maybe where I see the most important new elements of the renewed efforts to revitalize again EU's agenda for the Med. It is on the climate issues that clearly have climbed up on the agenda, and where the green transition will be an extremely, extremely important area for all of us to work on. I think also when it comes to the economic development and the even stronger emphasis on the importance of investment, but there I want to come back to the governance issues that are key. It will not be interesting and attractive to invest in the region unless there are functioning governance structures. On the economic side, I want to return again to the question on involvement both of women and of youth. This is a fantastic resource that can be tapped into. The question is, will that be done enough? And then we have the question of the digital transformation, which creates both opportunities, but I think also new risks, not least from a security side. Very clearly, we all have an interest, Europe and the countries in our southern neighborhood, to see stability. But at least I would argue that we cannot reach the stability. And I think that that also comes out very clearly in the joint communication and will come out, no doubt, in the council conclusions. Stability can only be reached if we also address the root causes, if we address the grievances of the people that I was mentioning earlier, if we can together work on meeting the needs politically, economically, not only of the governments of the region, but of the people of the region. And in all of this, good governance, inclusive participation are key areas. And so is, I believe, dialogue. The importance of creating spaces and room to talk not only to the usual suspects, not only government to government, not only people to people, but people and government, men and women, young and old, rich and poor. We need to somehow create greater opportunities to work for genuinely inclusive societies. And as regards the EU, I think an absolute key element for us is that we can stay true to our values, both internally within the union, but as well in our external relations, and not least when it comes to the neighborhood policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Let me just take advantage of your wealth of experience in the region, asking you a question here about civil society. You and I were both in Egypt at the time of the negotiation of the last partnership priorities, as they are called in the parlance of the relationship between the EU and the southern neighborhood countries. And you will remember how difficult it was then with the Egyptians, of course, who are not necessarily typical of the rest of the region, but how difficult it was to have any breakthrough on the participation of civil society in setting priorities, in getting involved in policy dialogue and the rest of it. Now, the communication has said that we should do more of this as EU, that we should encourage it. Do you think there's much prospect of it, not just in Egypt, but across the region? Is this, are these just words? Is it just lip service? Or do you see ways in which perhaps the EU could be smarter, more effective, more robust in its dialogue on the involvement of civil society in the way that you just mentioned?
Well, I think first of all we can always learn from the past, and I think maybe we need to also be better in sharing our own experiences. What is it that actually has worked in building Europe into what Europe is, and where it is much more of societal dialogues? I don't think that you can or we can ever be particularly successful in forcing any contacts, but I do think that we can facilitate. I think we can stress the importance. We can highlight both why it is important, but we can also make sure that in our involvement, we create projects in such a way that it also involves. But I think when it comes to all of these issues, it really is a question of implementation. And it's very easy to put nice words on a piece of paper. But as we all know, it really is a question of making sure that this becomes more than words. And I'm absolutely convinced that the EU also can do much more in facilitating the dialogues that are needed between different groups and between ourselves and the region.
Many thanks. Maybe we can get more deeply into that in the Q&A. And by the way, I'm sorry to tell you that I made a mistake. If you have questions and comments, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. You'll have to forgive me my technological incompetence at this point. But with that, I want to move on to our last, but by no means least speaker, Mark Otte, who is former ambassador for Belgium in the region, but at least as important, he was, of course, the EU Special Envoy to the Middle East for many, many years, and is now a senior fellow at the Egmont Institute here in Brussels. And he's thought very deeply about these issues. And I'm looking forward to listening to Mark. Mark, over to you. Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Over to you, Mark. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for putting this on the agenda. I think it's very important for Europeans in general. I agree with what the previous speakers have said and what you said in your introduction, so I don't want to come back on too many things that they have already put on the table, and leave it to the quick Q&A session to see what is of interest to the participants. But I think it's important. I would therefore concentrate a bit on the global context. First of all, the definition of neighborhood doesn't mean necessarily and immediately that you're friends. According to the security strategy, the first security strategy of the EU, we wanted to create a ring of well-governed friends. Well-governed is a question, but friends is also not necessarily what happens between neighbors. It can be competition, it can be coordination, it can be confrontation, or even simultaneously all of this. So it all depends on geography, history, it depends on natural resources, lines of communication, and so on. And certainly that has to be part of the analysis what is the long-term objective of a neighborhood policy. Secondly, when it comes to the MENA region, we have to make sure that we all agree on the same definition of what is the MENA region. What is Middle East? People in the region say it's a name that was given by others to us. They like more to be like South Asia or Southwest Asia, in a sense. And the second thing is that the lines of the Middle East are moving. You cannot continue, you cannot maybe find an agreement with Iran and the Gulf countries if you don't settle the question of Afghanistan. The issue of the refugees, the issue of drug control, drug trafficking, etc. So the lines are moving, and I often hear from my Moroccan friends that, well, we're not that much Arabs, we are more Europeans, and there's clearly an agenda in each of these countries to say we are more trusted partner than others, and therefore give us a better treatment than the others. Third thing is that the regional disorder is part of a global disorder. The end of the world of cooperative security, the end of the post-Cold War world is clearly there. So all the claims for multilateralism are separate from each other. We claim about multilateralism. The Chinese talk also about multilateralism, but they say it's my multilateralism that counts, and not yours. And therefore, I think we should accept that this new world order is one of transactional relations between countries, between blocks of countries, between allies, and as we see, for instance, in the Middle East now, how Russia and Turkey, for instance, have a transactional relationship about Syria. But this region, as has been said already, is too important for us to ignore. So if it's difficult, well, too bad. We have to be strategic thinkers more than just aid providers or lecturers about good governance, etc. If the Middle East becomes a black hole in the world of globalization, it's terrible for Europe. It will isolate Europe at the end of the Eurasian continent with only one facade, which would be the Atlantic. And as Charlotte said, there are other players that have to be taken into account. And when it comes to the Atlantic, well, our transatlantic partners are not that interested anymore in dealing with the Middle East, as we see. Even the Biden administration has clearly indicated that the pivot to Asia is not going to change. So it's a matter then of Europeans to become more adult and take responsibilities. This will not be solved by others. It will be spoiled by others, as we see the role that Russia is playing in, for instance, in Libya or in Syria. They're not working in our interest, and that is something where this is sometimes a bit overlooked. If you isolate just a neighborhood policy, the return of Russia in the Mediterranean means Russia is going to be encircling NATO through its south flank, and its interest is to sell weapons and to test weapons. The chief of staff of the Russian army has said that in Syria is good because they're testing new weapons. So the Syrians are so lucky to have these sort of friends. They're testing new weapons on them. So this is very crucial for Europe, and it's not about just statements and text and new credit lines that will change. The southern neighborhood, including with non-state actors, is a challenge to European security. Terrorism, refugees, it's a challenge to Europeans' economy. It's even a challenge to the model of society in Europe by encouraging or moving forwards the agenda of the populists or the nationalists in European democracies. There's been recently calls to a return to intergovernmentalism in Europe, in the EU, and not from Eurosceptics. So it is part of the impact of the what is happening, the instability that's happening in the Middle East that has to be taken care of. So the joint communication on renewed partnership addressed the current issues very well, I think, and touches on the right subjects, but it should include an introduction or a footnote who says why the past didn't work, why the previous instruments that we put in place since Barcelona didn't work, didn't change the status quo, which was the main criticism of the civil societies in the region, to say, you're very nice, you're giving us a lot of money, you're say nice words, but you don't change the status quo. That's what we want, and that's what we saw happening during the so-called Arab Springs, where people said enough. It can't go on like this, and we didn't pay attention. There was early warning. The Arab Human Development Reports of the UNDP made it clear what was happening in the societies of the region, but we didn't pay attention. We didn't pay attention because we were ignorant of the social dynamics in these countries, and most European countries, especially the big European powers, were more interested in maintaining stability than providing change or favoring change. Or they had pre-colonial prejudice and rivalries like France and Italy in Libya. So that has to be taken into consideration too, if we want to have really an impact and say, with all the tools that we put in place, well, we're going to change things for the good, for the better. But without naivete, if I may say, about the agenda of other players in the region or in outsiders, whether they are absent or whether they are working against our own interests. A word has been said about arms sale. I won't come back on that. The CIPRI did a very good study about that and showing that the Middle East remains the largest importer of weapons in the world. So the challenge of the new partnership is to stop imposing models from outside and facilitate regionally owned solutions. Renounce for once and for all regime change by force, and design the appropriate tool to implement the objectives using all sort of power, hard power and soft power. And I think this is something where the reflection has not been taken place already, but should at the highest level of power in Europe. So something has been said about empowering civil societies. I won't come back on that. Capturing the winds of change in the region with the normalization of Arab countries, with Israel and is important. And as I said, avoid privileging immediate crisis management over long-term strategies, which is the temptation of many of our policymakers, which requires leadership and coherence, which we need a bit more of at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. There's an awful lot to unpack in what you just said. Before we get into the Q&A, just a couple of quick points which relate to some of your points that you made. There are some people that say that when it comes to engagement on the foreign policy front in the so-called MENA region, everything is secondary to the JCPOA and finding a way through with Iran, meaning that in terms of a more robust dialogue, as it were, with some of the players in the region, that's going to be difficult because nobody wants to offend, especially the Gulf states, who in turn are supporting many of these regimes in the southern neighborhood, and that we shouldn't expect much until and unless we get back on track with Iran, with the JCPOA. Do you see much credibility in that? And the second question I've got for you is on Libya. I mentioned this earlier. Are you a little bit more optimistic about the EU speaking with one voice on Libya going forward this year, or is this really a mirage? You're muted, Mark. Can you unmute?
On the latter, Libya, I agree. There is progress, not only in the political situation in Libya, but on the positions of the EU being more coherent and more productive in terms of facilitating the transition. On the other issues, which was, remind me what was the other question?
On the Iranian dossier, because it seems to sort of outshine everything else at the moment.
Well, it is first a priority because of several elements. The first is that the new American administration has decided to return to the JCPOA, of some form of JCPOA, and that the Europeans feel it is crucially important to make it happen. So there have been this mediation of Europeans between Iran and the United States, which I think is important because of the role of Iran in the region and because of the risk that the current aggressive behavior of Israel and Iran against each other, the risk of something going wrong in terms of conflict situations in the region. And therefore, it is justified by the fact that we need the US on board and that the Europeans are coming to realize that Iran is not necessarily a very, how would I say, a partner that you can count on too much, not very reliable. There'll be elections in Iran soon that will probably bring to power a more conservative leadership. So there's some urgency there, but it doesn't mean that it needs to be the only issue that can be tackled by the Europeans. They can have their own priorities. They can tell the Americans, okay, we work with you on Iran, but we understand you don't want to continue your engagement in the Middle East, therefore help us do that in a manner that is conform to your interest, even if your own commitment is no longer as strong as it is. But I would therefore also underline that NATO is part of this deal about the Middle East, and NATO is developing its own tools and its own policies about dealing with the MENA region. So there would be some logic for the Americans to, well, once follow the Europeans instead of the Europeans following the Americans. And it requires diplomacy. Again, we need to accept that multilateralism doesn't work at the moment as much as it could or it should, but that we need to use also transactional diplomacy with those players who play only by transactional diplomacy, like Russia and China.
Thanks, Mark. So we move to the Q&A. We've had a number of questions in. Let me see if I can somehow group some of them together to get us through this. Let me first also check to see whether Nancy is still online. I don't think she is. Nancy, are you there? No? Well, I'm going to have to depend on Charlotte Starr and Mark Otte too. Nancy, you're still there?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So please feel free to come in. There are a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to try and group them together. The first one is more on the European side, and interesting one here, I think, which says that how much self-reflection should the EU make about itself in approaching the Mediterranean from a perspective of understanding the dynamics? And I suppose here there was a reference back to what's going on inside Europe, illiberal democracy, all of that sort of thing, whether the panelists would like to comment on that. I'll put together 2 or 3 questions, and please pick out what you would like to respond to. There's a question also more generally to everyone as to how to support as EU, how or should perhaps the EU be showing more activism in supporting the protest movements which have arisen since 2019, Algeria, of course, Lebanon, and so on, Egypt as well. Is there more that could and should be done by the EU in that regard? And the third question, which is more focused, less focused, I'll come to the focused ones in a moment. Is it really, and people have raised this question, does it make sense anymore to have one neighbourhood policy? which avoids a clear distinction between the Maghreb and the Middle East. Let me first turn to Nancy to see whether she'd like to address any of those issues. Nancy.
Sure, thank you. I'll try to answer those questions and also maybe just comment on some important points that Charlotte and Mark have mentioned. I think, like if we're talking about reflection for the EU, again, like I would like to repeat what I started with. It's the issue of mechanisms and policy tools, and to what extent the past agenda, and as Charlotte pointed out and agreed with what I was saying, there's nothing really significantly new about this current agenda, but what needs to be addressed and reflecting on the back is just like, why hasn't these goals been achieved or implemented? And it has to do with two issues. It has to do with the lack of effective mechanisms. And the other issue has to do with the approach to which those countries have addressed the problems and the grievances of the Middle East. The other issue, and I think it relates a bit to the point that Mark made concerning that how countries in the region are being isolationist or looking at themselves that they're not Arab or other sorts of characterization. And I think this is a reflection of the ultra-nationalism that is like, again, like going around the world, and it's not just particular to this region. The ultra-nationalism and the isolationism and xenophobia and all this is playing out. What feeds into that is the format of and the structure of the relationship between the EU and the region. And not just the EU, also the same issue is with the US, is moving from strategy to transactional relationships. Transactional between like each country and the region, where it's like quid pro quo sort of approach, that there are things to be achieved or arms deals to be implemented in exchange for particular policies. There isn't an overall unified, or at least not, if not unified across the EU countries, but at least like a common strategy. And again, I gave examples of what Denmark is doing now with the issue of asylum seekers and migrants from Syria. And you also have, for example, countries like France and Germany. They come as the third and fourth countries that are the highest in arms transfers to the Middle East. So there's like discrepancies in the approaches. There isn't a unified strategy and coherence, because this is what actually creates effectiveness, because otherwise some policies would certainly cancel each other, particularly when those countries are like providing sort of at least in optics support to the authoritarian leaders that are currently governing the Middle East. Meanwhile, while there is this separation going on the governance level, the ultra-nationalism, the population itself across countries is becoming more and more connected, particularly online. And that's a key issue. And that's, again, back to the youth, which is like represents 2/3 of the region, whereas the governments are taking separationist and isolationist policies and feeding into ultra-nationalism. The youth are connecting with each other. They relate to each other more across countries rather than their own governance. And that's key to the other question that has been asked and listed on the list of questions, is just how could we help youth? And I think one of the best ways and direct ways, of course, I mean, like improving education and the health system. I mean, like 60% of the children in the region cannot read and write. So that's really a huge challenge. So addressing those issues and also making sure that this space, the online space, remains open, because that's the only window of opportunity for youth to connect, to collaborate, to have knowledge exchange, which is not available in the physical world in those countries, given the hyper-securitization and repression of those governments.
Yeah, extraordinarily important internet governance, of course, which does feature in the EU policy paper, but I'm not quite sure what new tools might be available to encourage that. It's a big issue. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Well, let me start with the question of does it make sense to have one neighborhood policy? And I think that what we already have seen over quite some years is the mix of, so to say, a regional approach and a bilateral approach, and I think that both are equally needed. As I think we've all been touching upon, many of the issues that are facing the region and are facing us are transboundary issues. Climate change and the effects of climate change are obviously a point in case, and unless we work together also in a regional sense, it will be very difficult. So yes, I do think that it makes sense to also have one policy, even though we need to, as we do, complement it with our bilateral relations. On the question of self-reflection, I think we have a lot of reason to do self-reflection, and I'll just offer some thoughts. First of all, I think we really need to value our values and both remember where they come from and why we have them and why they have been part of helping building and developing Europe to what it is today. I think the other element is precisely the reflections on the shared interest. This is not us vis-a-vis someone else. We have quite a lot of interests that actually are mutual interests and where our future are closely interlinked. And I think that we need to really be careful in avoiding, say, the remnants of colonialism and Orientalism and so on, and try to really look for the common good. But also what we really have in common. And there I would like to make a pitch for the importance of both education and culture and human exchanges, but also for us to remember that in the last few decades, we have also been more and more interlinked by the fact that a big part of the population in many European countries also have an origin in our southern neighborhood. And the potential that creates for exchanges, for understanding, and the role that also the diaspora can play in that regard, but where I think that culture is key. So promotion of culture and of education, and not least educational exchange programs. And then I come back to the question of the stability and the so to say the governance issues. We will not, I believe, be able to see a stable and well-developing neighborhood unless the countries can manage to improve the governance structures in the political, economic, social, etc. Fields, and we can play an important role in doing that. And I think we can maybe be more effective. There was also the question on the dialogues and what is it that we've had in the past and what can we do more. And there I think that we see more and more of different stakeholders playing a role, and unless they actually have a seat at the tables in different ways and forms, I see also with the complex reality that we are facing that it's not one single actor that can solve all the issues. It really has to be a collaborative process. So it's really a question of a broad spectrum of actors, bringing in and continuing our dialogues, obviously, with the governments of the region, with civil society organizations in the broad sense, including faith-based organizations, academia, media, culture, again, the private sector plays a really, really important role. I mentioned earlier the intergenerational dialogue, and I think that is key. Gender inclusion is obviously key, also different social groups and different views. And that brings me to the question of youth engagement and what we can do more in that field. And I think it's not maybe even it can be important with youth programs or programs that target and are important for youth, be it on the educational side, and where the Erasmus Plus is something that I want to bring up here. But I think also when it comes to vocational training, lots of other things that needs and can be done. But it's also a question of allowing a space at the table for young people and making sure to bring them into again the dialogues, not only to the projects. Here, I think many again of the issues that we're facing look at the whole green transition and the solutions and the innovations that are needed. I think it is to a large extent the young generation who will be the driving force and already are the driving force in much of that change. But we also need to see more of youth participation, not least because of the demographic structure and the fact that the young population is in clear majority in the region. Political participation, but also participation in the peace and conflict resolution agenda. So last pitch for both the youth peace and security agenda and the women peace and security agenda.
Thanks, Charlotte. And finally, to Mark on this round. We'll have a second round after this. Mark. You're muted, Mark. Press your button.
Right, there you go. Okay, well, I agree with what has been said by the other two panelists, and I don't want to come back on that because it's part of my notes pertain to that. Would simply underline a few things like what Charlotte says about the diasporas in Europe. How these are sometimes very well organized. I've been part of workshops with the Syrian diaspora in Europe. And they were not people who were living in tents. They are doctors, artists, architects. The first Syrian refugee I met in Belgium spoke Dutch because he had been to a Dutch-speaking university and he wanted to continue his PhD in engineering that he had started before fleeing Syria. He was not a problem for integration. Some of the native Belgians are more a problem of integration than people like that. So I think it's important. The other day I was at the pharmacy trying to help in buying medication. And I saw on the other side of the desk the pharmacist speaking Arabic to a young woman who was asking for advice for her son who was sick, which sort of medication she should get. That didn't happen before. That didn't come in my childhood. That sort of thing could happen. When something happens in the Palestinian territories, repression or violence and so on, I see in my street Palestinian flags on the windows. They are not all Palestinians living there, but it's a sort of feeling that there is a connection. And this connection continues to have started a long time ago. It's the connection between the Eastern Mediterranean and Europe has started in centuries ago. At the start of the monotheistic religions. So the influence has always been up and down. The first Euromed structure that was created was by the Romans. So there's a long tradition of interacting, of talking to each other, of communicating. El Andalus in Arabic means not something in the Arab world, but in Spain. So that's why also I think it's important to continue to look at this partnership as a whole, but to have subtexts and systems that are dictated by geography. The question raised about the Maghreb and the Eastern Mediterranean is completely correct. And there are different partners, there are different groupings, the 5+5, for instance, where that get some Southern European countries together with Maghreb countries. So that is something that has to be taken into account in a global approach to the region and to a sort of sensible neighborhood policy. There you go.
Thank you, Mark. And it's an interesting point. I think that after an hour and 10 minutes of discussion and presentations, we had the first mention of Palestine. Had we had this debate 10, certainly 20 years ago, it would have been the other way around. It would have dominated much of the discussion, as it did under Barcelona and so on. Now, of course, it doesn't have the same pride of place. I'm particularly not aware of that, having seen last night a wonderful new short Palestinian film called The Present, which won the BAFTA in London recently and is nominated for an Oscar next week at the ceremonies in Los Angeles, which tells the story, of course, of a Palestinian man trying to get a present through the checkpoints to his wife. Very touching and very moving, but also showing you in a very evocative way that, frankly speaking, the situation is a bit even worse than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Question coming in from the audience here, and I think maybe Mark could start with this one, is what about the situation in Israel-Palestine? The EU paper, I think, does mention somewhere, or at least the declarations from Mr. Borrell and others have talked about the fact that the new so-called Abraham Accords that Israel has been signing with Gulf states of Morocco and Sudan and so on, could be built upon in a new peace initiative to come later this year. My question related to that, to all three of you actually, would be how best can the EU support a return to some sort of process, some sort of negotiation? There are elections coming up in Palestine as well, as you'll all be aware. Is there something happening here? Is it feasible to think of a little more Georgia, a little less war in the Middle East? Would be one question. Second question is on Turkey. Some of our participants are talking about that. Turkey not being awfully constructive in many areas of the region, destabilizing to some extent the policy. How best to deal with Turkey going forward, especially when it comes to relationships in the southern neighborhood. Complicated dossier, of course, with many aspects, not just that impacting on the southern neighborhood, but Turkey, basically. Any thoughts on that? How better to collaborate perhaps with Turkey would be a best way of posing that question. And the final question is on energy transition pathways have been mentioned. Big issue, of course, not just in terms of green economy and renewables, but also the longer term, which of course is the transition out of oil and gas. And what does that mean for the region? And how much emphasis should the EU be putting on stronger relationships on energy with the region? So I'll leave those three on the table, and I'm going to ask Mark to start off, and especially on that first question on Israel-Palestine, where he has vast experience. Mark.
Thank you, Jim. Well, I think you're right to say we are far from where we were 20 years ago, and the situation is changing in terms of priorities. When you speak about the Abraham Accords, I'm not saying, I will deny the fact that it is an initiative by some Arab countries in the Gulf in particular to resume a meaningful peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. is to create new alliances against Iran. And therefore, yes, the Israeli-Palestinian issues have taken second round to what is happening in terms of strategic rivalries in the region. So it will take some time before there is a new atmosphere conducive to Palestinian Israelis sitting together with the, I don't know, the mediation of the quartet again, or the UN, the US returning to the issue, or the Europeans playing a role. I think everybody has a role to play in this, but I think at the moment there are useful steps taken on the Palestinian side, which are the elections. It will restore a degree of legitimacy to the leadership, or not, because what we can see is the current leadership among the young people is very unpopular. Actually, they don't have a majority of votes of the young people in of people who have never voted. Actually, the last election of the president was in 2005. Last elections for the parliament were in 2006, and it never functioned. It never worked at that time for other reasons. And you have another problem, is that the political situation in Israel is terrible. They've had how many elections now, and they're still maybe expecting another because, and they have a prime minister who's an indictment for bribery and corruption. So I don't think it will happen in a manner that is speedy. So the Palestinian elections are good conditions to create a new atmosphere, but they are not enough. And there'll be a lot of confidence building measures that will have to be put in place. There is another quartet now that has risen in Paris, and they're speaking about that, about confidence building measures of economic, health, and humanitarian kind. I think that's the way to go, provided that the Palestinians can get their act together when it comes to their own leadership and own governments. But the help of the Arab countries, as you know, from having lived in Egypt, is crucial when it comes to get the factions together.
Sure. And I suppose you would agree that the EU should have an electoral observation mission for the Palestinian elections. I believe it's not proving very easy to launch it.
It is not easy to launch it because Israel keeps blocking the permits for an exploratory mission. And I'm afraid that when it comes to the first elections, there won't be an electoral observation mission, a full-fledged one. Maybe some experts guiding NGOs, but I'm afraid, given the time needed to prepare and to plan, there won't be a European observation of the elections, which is a very, very sorry situation because Israel is shooting itself in the foot by doing that.
Well, I think whichever side of the fence you find yourself on, all of those who believe in democracy find that to be a very sad story. I certainly do. Let's move on. Nancy, are you still there? And would you like to take up any of these questions? Looks like Nancy has fallen victim to her power cut. So Charlotta, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm not really sure I have anything to add to those questions, but I saw that there was another question, if you allow me to, that came in on the how the EU can bring promotion of democracy and inclusivity and not be imposing. And there again, I would like to offer some thoughts. One, I think it is important that we are humble. Secondly, that we realize that we cannot and should not drive the change, but we can support all those within the countries and within the region who are working for more inclusive societies, while at the same time being clear in standing up for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and ultimately commitments that the countries themselves have been doing to this global global agendas. So I think that it's a lot that can be done there, but also in terms of support. I think I stop there for now.
Okay, we've lost Nancy, so I think the last thing I'd just like to repeat it was on the Turkey question. Would either Mark or Charlotte like to offer anything on that? How are we doing with Turkey in the region? Should we be doing better? Is there more? Mark, perhaps?
Yes, okay. Well, Turkey has become quite a sort of free agent, if I say, or in the country, and is pursuing under Erdogan a neo-Ottoman policy that is not necessarily useful to European interests. You've seen the attempts of dialogue. There have been on the EU side a sort of trying to calm the atmosphere to talk to the Turks, even with the unfortunate Sofa incident in Ankara, and there is a realization that they have a lot of leverage on us. Refugees, economic, and so on, what they can do or not do with the Kurds in the region and so on. So I think here again we have entered an era of transactional diplomacy, but we are not there yet. And certainly there also the regime itself is not necessarily free to do whatever they want, because the economic situation is not good. They're still under sanctions also by the US. And the population is not necessarily all satisfied with the way the rule of law is being applied in the region. There have been some arrest of officers recently, military officers. So we have to watch the situation in an early warning mode, I think, when it comes to Turkey.
Fair enough. Okay, we got time for just one last question, if either of you would like to address it. And I think it's important to throw it in. It comes in last, it often does come in last, which is the question of regional cooperation. Charlotte, you and I are both former accreditors to the Arab League. We have a Euro-Arab Summit, of course, process, which since we left has come into being. But the situation on the regional front is pretty dire, and prospects don't seem much better. I could be wrong. But of course, many people point to this as being a huge weakness in the region, and a great contrast, of course, to what we have in Europe, Brexit notwithstanding. But nevertheless, we have a problem here with regional locking horns regionally with the neighbourhood. We've had it for a long time. What prospects there? First, Charlotte, would you like to comment on that? Go ahead.
Did you want me or Mark to come in first?
No, you first, Charlotte, and then if Mark's got a thought, we'll finish on that. Yeah.
Yes, no, but I share your views there, and as I said already in my introductory remarks, on top of the challenges that we are seeing with the regional cooperation that has been there already in the past, but has obviously been even more further complicated by the fact that we see all the conflicts in the region, and many of the countries that are on different sides in these conflicts. So that is making it even more difficult, I think, when it comes to the regional organizations and their work. But it's not only that. I think it's also the lack of cooperation even in the economic field, and that is something that still is doable. So I think that there are examples from some of the work that is being done, including in the League of Arab States, where, as I think both you and I have been seeing on the more technical issues, there has been some progress, and I think more work can be done in those fields. But also there, I think we need to maybe think not only of the governmental structures, but also the facilitation of networks and contacts that go beyond that, and look at the issue of transboundary water resources. So we had a couple of weeks ago a very, very interesting discussion for a couple of days with a number of organizations, including with the participation from Global Water Partnership, Union for the Mediterranean, several of the UN agencies, different organizations working in the region. And it's a lot of very interesting work that is going on, and where we actually have good examples of regional cooperation. So I think it's not all doom and gloom, and it's there are elements to build on, but maybe more on the technical side. And I think more can be done also there on the people-to-people side with cultural exchanges and so on.
Great. Mark, any final thoughts on that front?
Well, I fully support what Charlotte said about taking other channels to make things happen. Civil society, NGOs, SMEs. For some of the rich countries in the region, it's the transformation of their economy that is leading a possible cooperation. But they're more interested to cooperate with Europeans than among themselves. Like the United Arab Emirates, for instance, or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. But it's true that they still have to overcome a symptom among Arab leaders. A specialist from the region once told me, you know, when Arab leaders meet, they shake hands very amicably, or they kiss each other in public. But the next thing they do, they go to the toilets and they wash their hands. So it is something that is personal and needs to be solved by the people of the region themselves. And it's not up to us Europeans to tell that they must love each other. And peace doesn't make peace, not love, is the motto.
Very true. And it's not just Arabs who do that. I've seen it happen on the European front as well. I'm sure we're all in the same boat as far as that is concerned. Well, anyway, I think we've come to the end of our session. I want to give special thanks to our speakers, to Charlotte, to Mark, and to Nancy, who I think finally, as I say, fell victim to her power cut. I'm not going to try and summarize this discussion, but I think we've brought out a lot of points, a lot of food for thought, which you might want to carry on over your lunchtime discussions, insofar as we can have a lunchtime discussions these days. And I hope the next time we do this, maybe a year or two down the road, when we've seen whether or not the EU can deliver on this paper, that we can do it in person. Wouldn't it be nice to be around the table together? Again, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you to our attendees, and have a very good day. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.